Hey everyone, this is Critique Quest, and today I'm going to be talking about BLOOBERTEAM's first-person cyberpunk horror game for the PlayStation 4, Microsoft Windows and Xbox One called Observer. Set in 2084, players will take on the role of neural police detective Lazarski to solve a growing mystery, which will take him through the minds of some very, shall we say, interesting people, one of whom may be connected to Lazarski himself.
I am what they fear, a corporate tool of oppression. A despised leech that creeps into your dreams and feeds off your fears. If you don't remember, if you won't remember, that's when they call me. To access you, to gather evidence, to dredge up whatever's hiding in the darkest corners of your mind.
So, what works in Observer? I'm always ready and willing to give big points for atmosphere. Oftentimes, it's difficult to pinpoint what it is that actually makes a game feel a certain way, and yet so many games feel spiritually lifeless, like the veins are running dry. Even if the visuals and the lighting and the play look or feel great, there's just no ambience. This was one of BLOOBERTEAM's previous entry, Layers of Fear's greatest strengths, and Observer 2 has it in spades. The game is grimy and depressing, but in an enjoyable way, if you can believe that. Or perhaps I should say in an intriguing way that doesn't necessarily leave you feeling grimy and depressed by the end of it. That the game is set in a place called the Stacks, this universe's equivalent of a slum complex, really opens up a space for the player, a proverbial keyhole to peer into. And what we see is a petri dish of infected humanity. The game manages to evoke such a strong gut sense about this place and the larger world that you really don't need that much in the way of context. Where other games might shove codex entry after codex entry in your face, the world of Observer effortlessly just exists, and that allows you to process and interpret said fictional space in any way that makes sense to you, with or without reading emails or talking to tenants. And to simply make small suggestions to such great effect on the imagination is just really good mediated design. If you do read all the emails or talk to every tenant, you'll be treated to more tidbits that round out the world and bring it to life in a range of compelling ways. One thing is clear, the people here, and robots too now that I think on it, are lost. Oftentimes alone, or weakened by their attitudes, status, financial or physical states, locked away from one another, and Lazarski as well, behind an unfriendly intercom system. You'll find yourself interrogating an eye, a bunch of unidentifiable pixels, or a mouth.
Yes?
I'm with the KPD. Need to ask you some questions.
Oh, and who's your friend?
Friend? It's just me, ma'am.
Oh, I have to go now.
Alrighty.
It's all very strange, and also terribly saddening. Nobody trusts each other. Nobody likes anybody else, and is it any wonder? The tenants residing in the Stacks are the ones forgotten by society at large for one reason or another. A society, mind you, that doesn't seem to be all that welcoming to anyone. If this were a vision even in part of humanity's future, I'd turn the car around. Had it been set anywhere else, though, the feel of the game might not have been as effective. All that said, I don't think the physical space deserves all the credit for this spectacular atmosphere. BLOOBERTEAM once again work with composer Arkadiusz Reikowski, I hope I'm saying that right, but I couldn't find a pronunciation online, whose work in Layers of Fear was exceptional. So much so, I've been seriously considering doing a spotlight video on it for the better part of a year. Unlike the aforementioned game, Reikowski's work in Observer, though still melodic in parts, and I'll get to that, is primarily focused on ambience and ambient sound effects, which is sly and so very, very effective. When you take a place like the Stacks and underscore it with doom synth that grinds away underneath, it makes the air in-game feel heavier. It narrows and darkens the corridors, or gives the impression that there's a giant malfunctioning motherboard beneath your feet. There really aren't that many video game scores, that I'm aware of at least, made up almost entirely of ambient tracks. I can think of a few, but generally speaking, melody and recurring melody often trumps. Maybe because video game music is rooted in and evolved from level themes, and I'm getting off topic here. When the score does get musical, it off-puts in just the right ways. The only voices you hear are primeval sounding and thus not relatable to humanity but rather base instinct. And the occasional rave beat you hear blaring from an apartment or radio is stripped completely of human touch. This score does nothing but enhance Observer's already incredibly crafted space. This leads me to Rutger Hauer, who voices Lazarski, a shadowy figure working for the KPD. He's not so much the final reason why the atmosphere works so well, but a confirmation of it. People seem to be divided on his performance in Observer, and truthfully, so was I, in the beginning. His speech pattern seemed kind of off, but then something unexpected began to happen. As the story got weirder, Lazarski got less weird. I've never seen anything like this before in a game. I suppose one exception would be Silent Hill 2's James Sunderland, although he consistently spoke like he was in a dream, and so it was purely a matter of getting used to it and understanding why. But Lazarski's voice is all a matter of perspective. He starts out as almost a boogeyman type figure, only to become much more relatable later on, but only in comparison to the relative eccentricity of the plot. Hauer's performance then, in my view, is actually really fascinating in a way I would never have expected, and again speaks to the strength of the game's feel. The studio are truly proving their skill in this arena, and while Layers of Fear was bogged down in parts by sort of discordant images and scares that didn't always land, Observer is much more atmospherically consistent, and thus, I would argue, better. But some elements of play worked equally as well. For starters, Lazarski's detective modes and corresponding UI is really slick. Where the map in, say, Nier Automata is a good example, took on a rudimentary look that wasn't entirely helpful, the user interface in Observer, especially concerning Lazarski's detective scanners, managed to look appropriately dilapidated without negatively affecting the player's ability to play. Even the tiny details, how the scanner will pick up a potential site of interest before promptly ignoring it, for example. It's just always nice to see such care and attention paid to these sorts of easily dismissible background effects. Though the sequences where you play detective are relatively simple to navigate, you only really have 2 tools to choose from as well as night vision, you'll still find yourself combing the entire room, and thus it never feels repetitive or dull. The game also never really holds your hand. I take this as a positive, but I understand if someone else might feel otherwise. Main quests will show an update on your arm gadget thing, but that's seemingly all, and this space, as I said before, is pretty densely packed. After completing the game once through, I took a quick look at the trophies and realised I'd missed a great deal of largely contextual subplots that if I'd perhaps been paying more attention would have caught and sought out. Alas, I've apparently become so used to games telling me what to do and when to do it, my sense of curiosity died 1 or 2 generations back. Before I move on, I feel that the tenement building area, or level, is also worth a mention here. It's so claustrophobic and artificially lit in a way that doesn't really illuminate anything, and yet these dark, cramped levels are hiding things that you don't have to analyse to feel the impact of. Intercoms range in model and quality. Some ads intimidate with a propaganda vibe. Pigeons, smart these birds may be, but clean they are not, roost everywhere. Maps are pinned to the walls, like in a hotel, which make navigating the maze-like floors very confusing, as most tenants also seem to agree. Whereas most games want to open up the game world, give you space to run around in, Observer seems to want the opposite, to entrap the player in this sort of tomb. So playing detective in this atmospheric sardine can makes for a suffocating as well as engaging experience. Cyberpunk horror. What a fantastic genre concept. So what doesn't work? The pacing. This is perhaps the one area in which Layers of Fear did it better. Since that game was pretty much told or observed, no pun intended, from one unreliable perspective, it could control the pacing quite easily. But as a member of the Neural Police, Lazarski can hack into brains and so spends a bit of time taking trips through other people's minds. These sequences are mostly great, and when you start to realise that Lazarski's memories are actually intruding in on and mixing with that of another person, it really gets jumbled and bizarre, not to mention when he jumps into the mind of a dead person. That said, This naturally breaks the flow of the game, and handled just right, that wouldn't be too much of a problem, but the hacking sequences last for quite a long time. Too long, in my opinion. Transitioning from the present moment and into the past are not very smooth as a result, and it's easy to find your attention wandering during hacking sequences. Length undercuts the power of the images you're seeing as well. I found the initial moments to be much more memorable than the ones you see further down the line, purely because your senses have been long beaten into nullifying submission, which is such a shame because there is a wealth of compelling information to sort through, and yet it's all too easy to tune out. If only these walkabouts were a little shorter, I feel the problems could have been avoided. Something else that didn't quite gel with the overall flow of the game were the cat and mouse segments, of which there are so few it initially comes as quite a shock. Instead of adding another layer to gameplay, this, in my view, fractured it. When utilised well, cat and mousing contributes to gameplay in a way that adds urgency and an appropriate level of fear and tension. Amnesia and Haunting Ground are both great examples of this. In Observer, however, these segments simply pop up out of nowhere, seemingly, within the final few levels in the game. The ghoul itself is quite a clever psychological cog in the visual narrative, but seems out of place where play is concerned. Something similar crops up later with a series of security drones as well, and though the setting is quite interesting, it again breaks the overall flow of the experience. Both cases do this, I think, by serving the player a much tougher obstacle than had been seen prior and doing so a bit too abruptly. Whereas the detective work, hacking, interrogations and exploration balanced the experience, overall, stealth sections shattered that equilibrium. Perhaps if these segments had been littered throughout the entire game, it might have felt smoother, or they could have just scrapped it entirely in favour of atmospheric tension. Finally, as can be expected with a smaller game from a smaller studio, the game is a little rough around the edges. I played the PlayStation 4 version of the game, and the frame rate dropped a bit here and there, though how much of it was an actual dip versus a calculated style choice I'll never know. Clever way to mask it though, if the frame rate is an issue. So whereas the game crafts an incredible fictional space within Observer, and balances it with a blend of detective work and exploration, on occasion it can and does wobble a bit where stealth and hacking is concerned, neither of which render the game unplayable, however. In fact, I feel the game is still very enjoyable in spite of it. Before I wrap up this video, I feel it necessary to mention the plot, or more specifically, what you might be required to do. As I mentioned before, the game gets very weird and erratic, so much so, it can be hard to place what might be happening, how it pertains to what just happened, and what you should do about it. In the latter levels, a lot of stuff is funneled your way, and if you don't have the slightest clue what's been going on or have zoned out for even a second, it can confuse the choices you have to make. If you want to fully understand Observer's plot, it's probably best that you play it through more than once, because knowing what you know by the end at the start will certainly help you better understand it as a whole. That means a 7 to 10 hour experience will more than likely last 14 to 20 hours instead. I wouldn't class Observer as the kind of game you finish quickly and move on from. Put the time in, however, and you'll get much more out. I'm calling this a handy to know rather than a strictly good or bad thing. All in all, I was impressed by Observer. It's a competent piece of work, not just of science fiction, but atmospheric horror. Confidence like this is hard to come by, especially these days, but maybe that's just my inner cynic talking. And though it doesn't quite pay off in some areas of the game, it sticks to its guns and adeptly delivers a curious, self-contained experience, something that's just as likely to be enjoyed and picked apart as it is to baffle. Watching a team, in this case BLOOBERTEAM, evolve and grow across games is a part of what makes talking about them so interesting for me, especially in a case such as this where there's been clear exploration, growth, and change. From layers of fear to Observer, you can see what has been improved upon and why. As I said before, already they've proven themselves to be more than capable of spinning thick webs of atmosphere, so I can only expect them to keep experimenting in future, and for play to become more adventurous in their next project. Thank you for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this video. Feel free to share your thoughts and comments about Observer here, on my Facebook page or on Twitter, the links to which are down below. If you would like to read my blog post on BLOOBERTEAM's Layers of Fear, I'll also link it in the description. I try to read and respond to as many comments as I can. Before I go, I've just been made aware of a shout-out video that was made about me by a channel called Square One Games, who've been watching my videos for a while. And I just wanted to say a huge thank you for the kind words. I'll link their channel as well in the description box. It's always really lovely to know that your content is being enjoyed. And yeah, I really appreciate the time that you put into making the video. So thank you very, very much. And yeah, that's everything. So I will see you all soon in my next video, which, if I plan everything just right, will be next week, same time, Thursday. Bye!